Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the SERMAPod. This is the podcast for SERMA, which is the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I'm the founder and CEO of SERMA, Rich Lenkov. Very pleased to see you all today, and especially to have a all-star panel on our podcast today. Jess Meckley is the Associate Director of Risk Management of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. Jessica is also a advisory board member of SERMA. Jeff Gorder is VP of Crisis Response Services at R3 Continuum. Jeff brings over 30 years of clinical experience, including consultation and extensive on-site critical incident response and behavioral health support for organizations. He has responded directly to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Hurricane Katrina, the Newtown tragedy, Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, the Las Vegas Route 91 music festival shooting, and the January 6th breach of the U.S. Capitol, among many others. Dr. Angel Brutus is a member of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee's Psychological Services Leadership Team as part of the Department of Sports Medicine. She serves in this lead role, overseeing mental health initiatives within the Team USA movement, after serving as the inaugural Assistant Athletic Director of Counseling and Sports Psychology for Mississippi State University. Dr. Jessica Bartley is the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Director of Mental Health Services and a clinical associate professor at the University of Denver. Dr. Bartley is a licensed psychologist and a licensed clinical social worker, as well as a certified mental performance consultant with the Association for Applied Sports Psychology. Welcome, everyone, to a very timely and exciting podcast. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you as well.
Thanks for having us.
So we're talking today, obviously, about crisis management in the wake of on-field events, and specifically, of course, the Damar Hamlin situation. Damar Hamlin, as everyone knows by now, is the Buffalo Bills defensive back who on Monday Night Football in Cincinnati in a game against the Bengals collapsed on the field and had an incident where he was revived. He had to be revived immediately by on-field personnel, by medical personnel, and was immediately taken off the field, went to the hospital. And the good news was just discharged from the hospital yesterday, cleared to rehab at home, and hopefully resume his football career at some point. What really struck all of us watching, and I'm talking about, all over the world, was how serious an incident this was, and also the effect that it had, not just on people on the field, obviously his coworkers and opposing players, but really to everyone watching. That was really a traumatic event to all of us watching in real time this mental or this physical and mental health crisis unfold. So, Jeff, let's start with you because you've got a lot of experience in crisis management. Why do you think this incident was so impactful to us? Why did it affect us all so much, given that at this point, unfortunately, we're all really hardened to the idea of seeing crises on our screens every day? Why did this one impact us the way it did?
Well, I think because of the unexpected nature of it, and yet it also tapped into something that is universally human, that for all of us, when we are presented with a life-threatening situation, and that doesn't necessarily have to be us, we can be observing somebody else in a life-threatening situation where the mortality is unsure, it creates a powerful emotional reaction for all of us. For many of us, it can be shock. Just we kind of go numb and distanced emotionally from it. I don't know what to do. For others, it feels like I want to do something. I want to have some action, yet I feel helpless. There's nothing I can immediately do. And for others, it reminds us of our own mortality. It brings us face to face with the reality that could have been me. Why isn't it me? We're wrestling with that. And I think what's key about that is that with high-performing elite athletes and entertainers, this creates an incredible discordance because they are used to, through their actions, through their skills, through their talents and sheer determination, able to affect change. And when they're finding themselves in a situation where there's nothing I can readily do, it's incredibly unsettling at the very least.
That's interesting. And Dr. Bartley, speaking of, the feeling of helplessness, we're dealing with, football players, right, who are very tough. They're among the toughest athletes out there. They're big, strong performers. They're used to trauma, both physical and to an extent mental. Yet on this day, we saw a lot of these heroes of ours break down. A lot of them were visibly shaken. They were crying. They were leaning on each other, both emotionally, but also actually leaning on each other for support. So, speak to us about, having dealt with athletes for many years, the feeling that athletes can have in this situation of utter helplessness in situations like games when generally they are in control, right? You can't be a successful athlete without having some degree of control over the game plan, over your opponent, over what's going on. Yet in this situation, we saw their teammates and opponents just sitting around helpless. What's that feeling like, and how do you help athletes through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you named it well. The reality is there were so many raw emotions. It was so unexpected, that I think, the instincts kind of kick in, the emotional like rawness really kicks in. And you really saw a lot of, very masculine men falling apart and needing to lead on each other. And it reminds me of a situation, a few years ago, I was at the Western Stock Show in Denver, and we had been working with professional bull riding, and one of the riders actually died in in the ring. And it's something that these raw emotions come up. It's a risk that comes with the sport, but doesn't happen very often. And so it's actually interesting to even think of a sport like um, professional bull riding. There's only been 3 deaths in more than 25 years. And again, very dangerous sport. And so, as much as the risks, it just doesn't happen very often. And so when these things come up, it is pretty unsettling and unnerving. And it just ends up being very, very raw for a lot of people.
Well, it's really interesting that you say that. I want to bring Dr. Brutus in on that, because you talked about, the risk, and these players. I mean, I just heard Booger McFarland, right, a very prominent analyst on ESPN, discuss this a couple days ago, and he said, even knowing what I know now, even after Damar Hamlin, I would still take the risk, because football took me out of abject poverty in Louisiana and took me to where I could take care of my family. So they understand the risk, I think, physically. But Dr. Brutus, are we at the point yet where you think athletes have the requisite training and preparation for the mental trauma involved, right? I mean, we're all very much more familiar these days, thankfully, with a lot of the trauma that athletes go to from a high level. But yet, I don't think many of the players, given what we saw on TV, were prepared mentally for what they saw on the field that day. So speak to us about sort of how we haven't gotten maybe to where we should be in terms of preparation for that part of it, and hopefully learning from this going forward to get athletes better prepared to deal with some of the psychological trauma.
Well, and that's a very fascinating kind of question. I think, to Jess's point, there's a level of awareness and understanding of the risk that's involved every time you go on the field of play. It's just the rarity of the incident occurring, right? And so when you think about it in that nature, you can prepare in terms of increasing knowledge and awareness, but there's something to be said about the propensity for elite athletes having a high propensity and a threshold for risk tolerance in the first place, right? And so that also is at play in terms of the decision making. And so there's a dance or an art to being prepared, but also not increasing the likelihood for fear or intrepidation either, right? Because let's just face it, there's a level of risk taking that's involved in the decision making process every time you're on the field of play, whether it's being able to be very stubborn with the goals that you have in mind. And usually in some of these cases, there's a level of domination that occurs in the personality that's there. And when you are out there in particular sports that are aggressive or require a certain level of assertiveness, that domination piece kicks in. It could be looked upon as like a control piece, but really it's about domination. And so when you think about preparing athletes to increase their awareness about the risks that are potentially present, you also have to think on the other side of the coin in terms of being able to maximize and leverage the risk-taking behaviors and the propensity to operate at such a high level that you just don't want to set them up to increase the fear of potential risk, because that wouldn't serve anyone any justice. And actually, that would increase the likelihood for potentially more injury because of the timidness that would show up in the field of play. So,
That's a great
it's
point.
quite a balance in terms of the art and the science of it.
It's a great point. I mean, T. Higgins is the receiver for the Bengals that struck the Bill player, and I think he was very initially very worried, of course, and very upset about what happened. But then I saw another interview with him, and he was ready to go. And I think that speaks to what you're saying is you got to learn from it, and you got to have the requisite amount of preparation and fear. But they're football players. There's going to be contact, and what we've all learned now from this condition in the week or so that we've, since it's happened, we've all become experts in this particular incident. And we know that it's really a very unique circumstance that really happened, that really can't happen too often, thankfully. So I think you're right. I think, the message to most players and the conversations are, do your thing, be aware of this, but you can't really act too differently. But Dr. Bartley, bring us in like the room and in the 48 hours or a few days after this happened, what kind of conversations are going on between professionals like yourself and players, and how does that look?
Yeah, I mean, thinking of the situation with the Bills or even drawing from some of the experiences I know that I've been a part of, say with professional bull riding, some of the conversations were, particularly with that event that I was a part of, this is a 2-day event. Do we compete tomorrow? Are we done for the night? Is anyone else going to ride a bull? What do we need? Is everyone going to go to the hospital? Does one person go to the hospital? What's kind of going on? And so I think, thinking of the group that we're speaking to as well, there's a lot of decision making that goes on around kind of the sport, and does the sport continue? And again, knowing there's a lot of emotions. A lot of times they're very aware of the risk. The athletes are very aware of the risk going on. And there are also a lot of staff and support people around that are trying to make decisions. Again, I with Damar Hamlin, the decision, do we resume the game? There seemed to be some controversy. Did the referee make the, decision quick enough, or was that always the intention? Are we doubting that they were going to play or not play? And I think that's really important to think about all the decision-making pieces. And to be honest, I think that I know Angel and I at the USOPC quite a bit have to make very pressured decisions. We've done that at the Olympic and Paralympic Games. So I know one of the things we've had to do is really train ourselves to make those decisions quickly, with as calm or cool of a head as possible, to try to look at all the different perspectives. And we do that really daily, to be honest, when something comes up with the number of sports we support. But again, thinking of all the different facets, all the different emotions, all the different decisions. The reality is there's a lot of money at stake. There's lives at stake. There's emotions at stake. There's so many things at play. And so I know for us, we do a lot of emergency action planning. We do think about a lot of the different things that could come up and what the implications are. And again, you don't want to sit in that place of fear. But sometimes it is really, really helpful to think about it from a number of different perspectives. We meet with our safety and security team. We meet with Jess, with risk management. We talk to our legal team. What are legal implications? Finance, like what would be the consequences of that? So I think when we get in those situations, we can make really educated decisions while we're really tending to the emotions of everyone involved as well.
Jeff, thank you, doctor, for that. Jeff, what do the first few hours look like from your perspective? When you're called to the scene of an event like this, or Newtown, or some of the other really unfortunate tragedies you've been involved in, what are you looking for? What's your priorities? How do you triage with the number of parties involved here who have suffered some kind of trauma? How do you sort that all out quickly?
Sure. Well, and I think I really like what both Dr. Bartley and Dr. Brutus have shared, because I think it ties in. When we think about the emotional roller coaster that one experiences following being confronted with the unexpected and potentially threatening type of situation, the the bottom line is, if we admit it, we are our own harshest critics. And what likely happens is when we're experiencing all these emotions, particularly ones that are unfamiliar or unexpected to us, is that it's fertile ground for misinterpretation. We're likely to view those reactions as if maybe I'm not doing it right. Maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm not smart enough, strong enough. I'm not handling it like everyone else. Maybe I'm losing it. And that misinterpretation can take one, if not challenged, can take one down a completely negative path. And so part of what we do in that early intervention is help them understand, no, it's not that you're broken, that there's something wrong with you. You simply are human. And that what you're experiencing is the understandable reaction to this very unexpected, very abnormal event. That's your feelings are the normal part. What happened is the abnormal part. And that interpretation, as simple as that sounds, is so freeing, because it allows them to say, okay, I can take a deep breath, extend a little bit of grace to myself and those around me, and decide what's the next right step. But it allows me to view it in the right context instead of viewing it as somehow a personal failing.
And if you don't mind, Rich, I could add to that too, just thinking about previous experiences, sometimes being boots on the ground and then sometimes being at a distance trying to help, contain all the things that are happening. I think within those first 24 hours too, whether it's in the acute crisis stage, you're assisting in whatever role makes the most sense. And so there are going to be multiple people who converge on the scene and instantly want to assist. And sometimes being the person to help create and buffer space is very important in that moment in time, because everyone wants to feel helpful. And so, we often emphasize with our team or our staff is that anytime we're managing a crisis, you're not doing it alone. And so the more that you can identify the roles and functions of individuals that are in that immediate space and give people assignments, the more likely you are to start to create some kind of system that's in place to address the acute pieces. And then also at the same time, start the process of containing the privacy of the person who's directly impacted. Because the other piece of it too is, more oftentimes than not, if something is happening in a public space, everyone who's witnessing and observing will feel some sense of entitlement to know the outcome or to continue to be involved in the process. And that might have implications for risk management or liability down the line. And so being very cognizant of that requires a level head, as Jess has mentioned, and also as Jeff has mentioned. So there are multiple layers that are at play at the same time. And then that looks different when you get into the intermediate stage of the crisis. And then, of course, the more longer term pieces. So I just wanted to kind of address a little bit of that too, because all of those things are simultaneously at work.
It's really interesting. I saw Jessica Beckley, nodding her head. I mean, what hasn't been discussed too much, what's very interesting and sort of a sign of the times is, we've got millions, maybe even billions of people now intimately familiar with this medical episode of Damar Hamlin. And, I think he's handled it really well. But, most people don't want all the details of a serious, probably the most serious medical episode in his life out there in the public yet. Not only do we have all that info out there, but we've got pictures of, a very vulnerable time in his life out there. So, I think he's handled it well, but I think that's a really interesting component of it. But why don't you all talk about sort of what your take is? And I think worldwide and everyone who's observed it has given nothing but, praise for the way it's been handled, particularly from, the staff on the field who basically, saved his life. But talk to us a little bit about what we saw and how important it was. I know you're not, per se medical, physicians and deal with this, but how do you think the team and the organizations handled this crisis? And, maybe what can we learn from it going forward on how to do things differently, if anything?
Yeah, I can
Jeff,
kind
you
of
could
start.
start.
I think,
All right.
oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say the first thing that comes to mind for me is understanding in a crisis situation what your competencies are. We make it mandatory for all of our staff members to be certified in CPR, first aid, and operating an AED. so that way you can step in and assist in whatever role is called upon. As Justice mentioned, even having emergency action plans, we also have a psychological component in that. And so even our administrative staff are a part of those role playing incidents. And so it really is about creating an opportunity to increase the likelihood for people to have touch points across the spectrum as long as they are a part of our organization. Um, Again, the critical pieces are being able to address the immediate needs from a medical emergency standpoint. You know, who's the person that's the point of contact in contacting emergency services? What we witnessed was a great reaction time from the medical staff to be able to do that, but some people don't necessarily have those same kind of staff members on hand. And so it's really important and critical for a lot of organizations and institutions to make sure that their staff is trained up, but also running through practice runs of what to do in those high intensity, high pressure situations.
Right. And you don't know, Dr. Bartlett, do you, really how people are going to react? You could do all the tabletopping in the world, right? But I mean, until you have an on-field event, watched by, tens of millions of people, you don't necessarily know if all that training is going to work. Some people react differently. Some people just are shocked and sort of freeze up.
Well, and I think what's interesting too is to think about the number of things that we practice and become really automatic, though. And so I think that, I would like to think that with the number of times I've managed somebody with suicidal ideation, I don't think that I've really become desensitized to it. And I feel like it gets easier with practice, or I become more effective with practice. And so I think that is the piece that we really try, particularly at the USOPC, as we're practicing these things. You do rely more on muscle memory, and you don't rely so much on those really raw emotions because you've seen it, you've heard it, you've been through it, you've seen different variations of it. And so again, like sitting with someone who's suicidal, sitting with someone who's lost someone significant, there are a lot of different scenarios that we practice. And while there still are those emotions that come up, it's actually interesting to watch or experience the fact that it doesn't quite hit you in the same way if you've been there and you've done that and you've practiced. And even, again, we try to do that as much as we can in this space as well.
Mm-hmm. And there was something that I thought was subtle that I just wanted to highlight. I witnessed so many incredible expressions of resilience, particularly from the players as well as the observers, the nation, as we rallied around that. And I use that term rally very specifically when we saw the examples of the team gathered together, when we saw individuals kneeling in prayer or other expressions of faith, when the communities donated to the GoFundMe page and things along those lines. They may seem like, well, really, what difference did that make? But it's important to recognize those are expressions of resilience. Instead of that sense of helplessness that people had, they replaced it with an act of agency, doing something. I can do this. I can engage in this right now. We can pull together in a sense of community. And there's tremendous power in that. And those were the natural resources that those athletes, as well as the communities around it, turn to. I think it can be missed, but I think that's powerful resilience.
Well, resiliency is really an interesting term and really comes into play here. And what struck me also from our conversation today is, again, we're dealing with such an interesting dichotomy in athletes, right? These are very macho, very large individuals, right? We see them as these larger than life figures that are indestructible. But in many ways, I think they are among the most aware of their, psychological senses more than many other coworkers. And I think about, for example, how many times you hear, players tell each other they love each other, right? I mean, I don't think I've got some great coworkers. I've worked with some for, almost my whole career. I don't think I've ever told any of them I love you. Yet that's a really common thing to hear among athletes. I was just watching, Hard Knocks in season with the Arizona Cardinals. Not a great season, by the way, because they just fired the star of the show. They just fired the coach, right? But I'm going through it, and I hear Bill Belichick, the winningest coach of all time, tell DeAndre Hopkins, a player for the opposing team, the Cardinals, they said they love each other, and they said it just as if they would say, "Hey, you want to go to lunch?" So what struck me there is how, in some ways, athletes are a little more expressive and maybe more aware of their feelings, and how that, Dr. Brutus, Dr. Bartley, has probably served them well in the wake of what happened on the field.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, honestly, because when you think about the seconds that are involved, especially in sports that require what we call in the sports psych world open sports, where you are pretty much vulnerable to the environment and have to make split second adjustments from a reaction time standpoint. Those split second moments are filled with a number of different emotions, whether it's joy, elation, trepidation, fear, anger, irritability, distractibility, like all of that is at play in a very short window of time. And so for a lot of athletes who have made it to the professional level or even the elite level, uh, that's a skill set that has been refined time and time again. Even if some people are not able to put words to it or vocabulary to it, they've experienced it and have been able to use it and leverage it to the best of their ability. And so what you're talking about is the refinement of that skill set coming to life and kind of transcending the sport performance side of things.
Dr. Bartley, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, I think some of the skills and the tools that we use are, I'm a naturally anxious person. How do you funnel that, perfectionism, some of these skills? That's a lot of times what we're doing with the best of the best athletes, the highest of performers, is how do you kind of use that to your ability or strength, and that's what kind of comes to mind for me of around how much these high performers have, like Angel is saying, refined these skills is so impressive. And so just it's, that again, that's really what comes up for me.
Jeff, one of the other things that really struck me over the last 10 days or so was, seeing the effect that this has had on young people. My son is 13 years old. He's a great athlete, starting point guard for his team, loves football, loves the NFL. We were watching together the game and everything unfolded, and he was really, really affected by it. He wasn't going to play tackle football anyway. He's a really good quarterback in flag football, but I think he was really affected by this and really happy on the other side that it's worked out this well. But how do young people react to these kind of things? And my second question is, have we all become desensitized? I mean, my son being maybe the exception, but as adults, are we desensitized to this, given how every day, unfortunately, we're seeing more tragedies, more shootings? Does that harden us? Does that make us more used to this kind of thing? Or, is my son more the standard, which is, very, very shocking event and very traumatizing?
Well, I think that for many of us, it was incredibly humanizing and inspirational to see the way these, as you say, elite athletes at the peak of their game pulled together and were able to express vulnerability. That is not a weakness, that's a strength. And I think for so many individuals, what they saw was the same passion that makes them excel on the field. They were able to use that same passion to support each other, to support Damar, to support the community. And I think, we don't often, again, in typical expressions of athletic endeavors, we think of that passion towards the goal of winning or dominating, as you said earlier, Dr. Brutus. But that passion can also be used to inspire, to sustain, to re-engage with that confidence and just sort of our basic universal humanity. And so I think that's what your son was resonating with. It was, I think, a proud moment for many of us to see how we pulled together. And quite frankly, we've had few enough of those moments over the last few years. So it was something that we all thought was a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, and it just I think about my role as a sport parent, and sometimes youth and adolescent sport participants are still trying to figure out their identity in the sport world, and that exploration can be fruitful, I guess, space to explore. Well, what does the sport really mean to me? How much do I want to invest in it? What are the risks that are involved? Um, not at the level at the professional level, but it's just something to consider in terms of their stage of development from a youth and adolescent standpoint, but also their stage of development in their sport context as well.
Thank you for that, Dr. Brutus. And while we have you, we'll end off with each of you maybe giving our listeners and our viewers maybe like one or two takeaways. We try to always at SERMA provide some useful content and certainly takeaways that our members can use in their practice. So, what's any advice you could give to teams, organizations, providers of services like this, or maybe even athletes, as to what we can learn from the Damar Hamlin situation, from the situation with the the young student athlete of the U.S. Air Force Academy who unfortunately died on Monday after suffering a medical emergency, Hunter Brown. What can we all learn going forward from these events? We'll start with Dr. Brutus.
Yeah, I think the thing that comes up for me, given the target audience for this podcast, is don't be afraid to design and develop emergency action plans, regardless of anyone's medical background. Everyone can have a role when it comes to crisis intervention. And don't be afraid to identify gaps in it, because it's a refinement process. It's something that requires revisiting, and it's also something that requires practice. And don't forget to implement or integrate mental health components into that as well. So I think that would be my takeaway.
Thank you. Dr. Bartley.
Gosh, I think she stole mine. No, truly, I do. I mean, in practice. I mean, if you think of all the things that we spend time practicing, this could be so valuable. And this could be something, again, like an emergency action plan or any sort of crisis response. And think about all the different perspectives, think about all the different folks that could really refine or improve an emergency action plan. Again, we really try to be as inclusive as possible at the USOPC to think about, what perspective are we not thinking of? Some of the even protocols we've put in front of the athletes themselves, like how would this feel if this was you who was experiencing the emergency, and even getting feedback around whether it's an injury or a death in the family or some of the different pieces, someone struggling with substance use or abuse, hospitalizations for mental health. We've tried to run a lot of our emergency action plans by as many folks as possible to poke holes in it and do that, as humbly as possible to continue to refine our processes when things like this come up. And then we try to practice. We try to, just really try to push ourselves for when these things come up.
And Jessica Meckley, I know that you defer to your coworkers who are superstars in this area, but I feel like we'd be remiss if before we got to Jeff, we didn't let you just chime in briefly about, from the risk management perspective. We've got lots of risk managers from, sports organizations who are listening and watching. What's maybe a takeaway that, from your perspective, that we could learn from Damar Hamlin's story?
I think there's two, and I think Angel brought up a really, really critical point about people being entitled to news updates and to information that honestly in any other scenario and for any other situation they would not be privy to. And that's okay. It's okay to keep someone's data private. It's okay to keep the only the close family and need to know folks involved. And so it's critical to piggyback off of what they said. When you're practicing these emergency management plans, factor in how you share and disseminate information, what information is going to be shared, and to whom and how, right? So if if the situation, say it's a big enough situation where multiple parties are involved, you have one website where updates are shared, period, and that's it. And we're not sharing anything else because of privacy. And you need to protect the people involved just as much as you need to support those who witnessed the event. And there is a balance between the two. So I think that's a very important factor to consider. And I don't think it's considered enough as far as emergency action plans go.
Great points. We'll end off with you, Jeff.
Well, good. So I'm gonna share sort of two perspectives. One from the crisis response behavioral health perspective, that given that tendency to misinterpret and how a misinterpretation of my reactions can take me in a wrong direction, the three things that I encourage folks who are coming alongside individuals experiencing this. The first one is ventilation, allowing them to identify and talk about what it is they're experiencing. Then validation, being able to quickly follow that up with a confirmation that, yes, what you're experiencing, what you're going through right now makes perfect sense. The event is the abnormal part, how you're feeling, completely normal. And then the last part is education, giving them that some skills for coping, some skills for managing it. How can we come together? What's the strategy? What's the plan for managing this event? And so those three things, ventilation, validation, education, are the professional piece. Now, on a personal piece, what I am just struck by is that this is one of the few incredibly rare types of crises that actually had a positive ending. And I think it's worthwhile taking a moment and acknowledging that. And I think what came through this is the incredible power, the unifying power of hope, and that the expressions of resilience at all levels, from the community, from the individual athletes themselves and the teams and the commission, the unification of hope and resilience is something that I think we can all rally around.
Very well stated. Dr. Jessica Bartley, Dr. Angel Brutus, and Jessica Meckley, all of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and Jeff Gorder from R3 Continuum. Thank you so much for joining us today on the SERMAPod. And Jess, I would be remiss if I didn't remind our viewers and listeners of an event where they could meet you all in person. That will be our SERMA event at the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee training facility in beautiful Colorado Springs. That will be on March 23rd, full day event. We're discussing reputational risk. And, this is a good segue, Jessica, because, in addition to what we've talked about today, it's also a good example of reputational risk, right? I mean, the NFL in particular, I think, maybe experienced both sides of that, right? In some respects, many admire the way the NFL handled this and their reaction to it. In some other ways, they've been criticized in even considering playing the game in some of the reactions. So perhaps we'll use this as a test case for one of our discussions in Colorado Springs. But I encourage everyone to come out, join us in Colorado Springs. Check out our website, which is theserma.org, for events like that, podcasts like this, and lots of other exciting content. I thank our producer, Matt Liller, and thank you all again, panel, very much for your contributions.
Ideas, strategies, and opinions represented on this podcast are those of the speakers and do not represent the ideas, strategies, and opinions of their employers.